Why the hell did I quit working at this $1 million dream studio to work from my home studio instead? I'm Thomas and I decided to take my dog Juno on a road trip to Spain. We are in España after quitting my dream job at this insane recording studio. In the first video of this series, I've talked about how I got into music and then later into recording and mixing, and then landed my ultimate dream job at RedBull Studios, which you now know as the Atlantisstudio in Amsterdam. After almost 10 years of being involved and running that studio, it is time for me to move on to the next adventure. And what exactly that is going to be, you'll find out later in this video. Now it was time to start my dream job, and I had gotten the keys to the most amazing studio that I could now completely make my own. At this point, the DIN Audio M4 Minis were installed into the wall already. My very first day was actually installing the SSL 4000 together with the team. At this point, I was living the dream. RedBull had given me complete carte blanche as to how I was going to set up this studio and how I was going to route things to make it fit my very own workflow perfectly. We did have some gear already from the previous studio, but it wasn't nearly enough to fill up all of the racks in the control room, so I guess I had some shopping to do. I was the kid in the candy store I always was, but now I actually had a budget. So I bought Neve 1073s for the studio, a CL1B, Lexicon 480L, a massive passive and a master bus processor, a set of KM84s, a Flea 47, a Neumann U67, all the gear that I had ever dreamed of, I could now use on a daily basis. We are heading out to check out another studio. This time it's Venue Retreats. It's about an hour south of Valencia. But apparently they've got like an amazing villa with like a swimming pool and 35 bedrooms and a fully blown studio with amazing views of nature. So I cannot wait to get there and see what they've got going on over there. Okay, let's go. When I drive through landscapes like this, I'm really questioning myself why I always go on holidays to cities and always go sit in a concrete jungle and not just go and find nature like this. Oh, I'm so glad I made the drive out here. This is amazing. That should be the place. Turn left. Wow. Look at that, guys. That is amazing. Yo, look at this place. They've got 2 swimming pools, plenty of room to hang out and ride, and these views are insane. Inside there's a fully equipped studio with a 36-channel Neve VR, plenty of outboard gear and mics, and a lot of couches to chill. Also a very nice live room with a Yamaha grand piano. This was what I was made for, and I made it. I was head audio of one of the most prestigious studios in the country, but at 22 I wasn't quite a veteran. I had to figure out how to further set up this studio to make it as plug and play as possible and to give every producer or engineer coming into this room the best experience ever. There was still a lot for me to set up. I had to set up the monitoring system for the artist in the live room. I had to further fine-tune the DIN Audio main monitors, and I had to get near-field monitors because we didn't have any of those yet. I also needed to figure out the entire patch bay and check if that entire 40-channel SSL console was actually working as it was supposed to. I was making 16-hour days at this point just because I was so passionate to finally be in the room, be in that studio, and at this point I couldn't even begin to think that I would ever feel different about this studio, let alone thinking about quitting it. RedBull Studios was purely for marketing purposes, which meant that none of the artists that were working there were actually paying for the studio time they were using. To get into that studio, you actually had to be handpicked by the culture marketing team from RedBull, and only if they thought you were an artist that would fit the RedBull brand could you get an invite into the studio. because everything we did at the RedBull Studios was for the marketing side, for the brand Red Bull, we could do a couple of really interesting projects. We did Uncut, for example, and as the name suggests, it was a live performance video that was uncut. So it was not edited whatsoever, not in video, but also audio-wise, there was no editing whatsoever. This was truly my playground because I could put all the instruments and the musicians in one room and we had to make it work. We had to make sure to position all the instruments in a certain way that it wasn't bleeding into each other too much, and it was a lot of fun. We did sessions with many great Dutch artists like Fulltime, Mr. Prob. We even went to another studio, Studio 150 in the north of Amsterdam, which is basically a church converted into a studio, and there we recorded an amazing video with Steen. I also, for a video together with Raymond, took half of the gear belonging to the studio, put them in racks and set them up in basically a marble hall in the Tropical Institute. That's like a museum here in Amsterdam. It was crazy. I'll link the videos in the description down below if you want to take a look at it. I also made videos about how I made those uncut videos and what came into play when positioning people and dealing with spill and everything. So if you want to check that out, I'll link that down below as well. And besides doing all the marketing projects for Red Bull, we also were just a normal functioning studio. So we every once in a while had a couple of cool artists coming in. So I had a session with FKJ, who I already had sessions with before that time. I've had people like the Chainsmokers come in during their all-time high when every hit on the radio was them. And I think the coolest one must have been Wu-Tang Clan recording RZA and Ghostface Killah for a Miley Cyrus song. I know it's a really weird combination, but basically she did a spin-off of Cream, Cash Rules Everything Around Me. She made it into Dream, Drugs Rule Everything Around Me. And the B part is Wu-Tang Clan, Ghostface Killah on that track. I recorded that, RZA produced the beat. And I even recorded YDB, Young Dirty Bastard, which is Old Dirty Bastard's son. So he basically imitates his father, but then he's the most polite guy ever. It was a really fun contrast. The more I drive around, the more I realize that the part of this trip that I like the most is the actual driving and taking in the views. Look at that. Wow. I decided to make a little bit of a detour, and I have to say I'm very, very glad I did. I will be spending more time road tripping through Europe, guys, because I cannot get enough of this. Red Bull working on project base with artists also meant that we could spend a lot more time on their project than you could if the artist or the label would be paying the studio bill. And on some projects, we spent an insane amount of time. For Nnelg's album Balans, for example, we took about 80 studio days to record, produce, and mix the entire album. We truly went all out on that album. We recorded instruments on top of the beats they already had. We re-recorded all the vocals because now we could do it with an amazing vocal chain, and we tried everything we could in the mixing process. We were able to create a playground for ourselves that we would never be able to do if it was outside of this collaboration between Nnelg and Red Bull. I don't know if spending 80 days on an album makes it better than if you do it in 20, but the process was a lot of fun. Besides Uncuts, the Red Bull project, and all the daily sessions, there was another really fun project called Swift 16. Swift 16 was basically a vocal showcase of up to 60 seconds for Instagram, and every artist got about 1 hour to come into the studio, get behind the mic, load up the beat, record a couple of takes, find the best take, for me to mix it and master it and then bounce it, and then for the next one to come in again and do that about 8 times a day. And that is exactly where having all of that gear at your disposal became very crucial. We were truly on fire at this point, doing projects every single day, having artists in the studio, making records, creating content, making an impact on the culture, and building the Red Bull brand. And then COVID hit. Nobody was allowed in the studio anymore, and it got very, very boring, and all I could do was mixing. However, we did do this project called 60-second solos in which instrumentalists, whether they were playing one instrument or 6, were doing a 60-second showcase of their track, and they would basically do a sort of an uncut session, but then with just one player in 1 minute. So now with the COVID regulations and everything, I couldn't have them come to the studio to record, so I had to basically build like sort of care packages with microphones and a GoPro and stands and all of that stuff, and bring that over to them so they could record themselves, and me dialing in through FaceTime to guide them through how to set up the mics and everything, and then later mixing that in the studio. A positive thing about the downtime we had during the COVID lockdowns was that we now had the time to actually get that SSL fixed, because there was one problem I had with the SSL. A big reason why I'm doing this road trip is because I want to see if I want to actually move here someday, and a big part of making that happen is having access to pro studios here in Valencia. So I'm on my way right now to Hive Recording Studios to see if that could be a place that I would possibly rent whenever I'm here. We start in the control room equipped with PSI monitors with a sub and a pair of NS10s, IC1073s, an Avalon 737 and some Grace Design preamps. Here's the live room with plenty of space for a full band and also a Yamaha grand piano. They've got a great mic collection including a pair of M49s and a vintage U47, but no worries, they also have your usual suspects. The live room also has a booth if you're in need of some extra isolation, and this booth even has some daylight. This Vermona synth looked very cool. They've got plenty of guitar amps, and yes, the couch has passed the Juno test. Every week I was recording this hip-hop podcast called Convo Talk Show, and I ran all of those microphones through the desk, mixed it on the SSL, mastered it through the master chain I had, all while they were filming it in the live room. And that worked absolutely great until the SSL started showing its age. A lot of this old gear is based on capacitors, and capacitors are basically tiny little batteries with acid inside them, and when they get old, they can start to leak. And when acid starts leaking, it starts eating away at everything around it. So it starts eating away at the PCB, the print board that they're soldered onto, and it'll eat away the other components around it. So what you want to do is replace those capacitors before that process has any chance of happening. Luckily for me, it hadn't gotten to that point yet, but the capacitors did start to show their age. Because very often during that podcast, when the levels would get low enough because someone just spoke really softly, you could hear it break up, almost like a gate, but then sounding like a bit crusher. Kind of like this. Yeah. Not a great sound for a podcast. Besides that issue, it was a 40-channel mixing console set up for the 80s, 90s. Back then, they didn't have any computers, so you would just have a tape machine somewhere in the other side of the room, and the desk would actually be right in front of you. Now, nowadays, I have a different workflow. I need my computer, my laptop, or my keyboard and mouse. I need that to be in the sweet spot so I can actually make proper mixing decisions while mixing in the box. So I had the brilliant idea of basically cutting the SSL console in half, then taking out the middle bucket of 8 channels, throw that out, and slam a rack in the middle where I could house my mastering gear, and I could have like a so-called producer desk that could house my keyboard and mouse, so I could actually make it fit in my 2020 type workflow. So we brought the desk over to Mark 1's workshop, where the desk got stripped to its bare frame. They taught me how the recapping process works, the process of desoldering the capacitors and soldering on new fresh capacitors. And I basically recapped the entire desk together with their team. After a couple of months, the desk was done, it got back to Amsterdam, it got installed, we had the TC electronics meter flush mounted in there, we got the Lexicon 480L remote built into the desk. It was the most amazing console I had ever seen. We were ready to rock and do sessions again with the freshly refurbed SSL console. And then came the news from higher up at RedBull that we were all fired. Oh, did I mention that I just spent all of my savings on a car 2 days before I got that news? Yeah, Fun times. Red Bull needed to make some budget cuts and the studios had to go, unfortunately, so they sold about 8 of the 11 studios worldwide, I think. Luckily, we were able to wrap up the rest of the year, and for me, it was now time to find something else to do with my life. And I think you know what I started doing. That is it for this part of the video. If you want to support the channel, please take a look at the Thomann affiliate links down below. They don't cost you any extra if you buy anything, but it will help me a lot to run this channel. Leaving a like is very much appreciated, so is subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to get a deeper dive into recording and mixing, you might want to hit the join button down below. That will take you to the virtual internship. And as a member of the virtual internship, you'll get exclusive access to very in-depth videos about recording and mixing. Okay, I'll see you on the next video, in which I'll talk about the Atlantis story after Red Bull sold the studio and what I'm about to do next with my career. So stay tuned for that. Later!